August 2nd, 1943. 02 hours.
Blackett Strait, Solomon Islands. Lieutenant Junior Grade John F. Kennedy gripped the wheel of PT-109, scanning the darkness ahead. His plywood patrol torpedo boat, a vessel so small and seemingly fragile that Japanese naval officers called them mosquitoes, was about to change everything America understood about naval warfare. Through the moonless night, Kennedy's crew of 12 men operated what conventional wisdom said was a suicide mission, taking 80-foot wooden boats armed with torpedoes into waters controlled by the Imperial Japanese Navy. The PT boat concept seemed absurd by traditional naval standards: plywood hulls that offered zero armor protection, gasoline engines that could explode if hit, and crews exposed on open decks with no protection from gunfire. Admiral Raizo Tanaka, commanding Japanese destroyer squadrons in the Solomon Islands, had reviewed intelligence reports about American PT boats with undisguised contempt. In a May 1943 briefing to his officers, he stated, "These American motor torpedo boats are toys pretending to be warships. Wooden construction, no armor, minimal armament. One shell from our destroyers' 5-inch guns will obliterate them. They represent American industrial confusion, building thousands of vessels that cannot survive combat." Kennedy's boat displaced 56 tons. Tanaka's destroyers displaced 2,500 tons, over 40 times heavier, with armor plating, multiple gun turrets, and crews of 240 trained sailors. By every measure of naval power, the PT boat was hopelessly outmatched. But Kennedy and 1,500 other PT boat commanders across the Pacific were about to demonstrate something revolutionary: that speed, stealth, and aggressive tactics could defeat size and armor; that small, insignificant vessels operating where big ships couldn't go would sink more enemy shipping than many conventional warships; that America's ability to mass-produce thousands of expendable plywood boats would prove more strategically valuable than a few heavily armored cruisers. What happened in the next 2 hours in Blackett Strait would become one of the most famous naval incidents of World War II, but not for the reasons anyone expected. PT-109's story would reveal both the incredible potential and the shocking vulnerabilities of America's unorthodox approach to naval warfare. Before we continue with how these plywood toys revolutionized naval combat and drove Japanese admirals to distraction, I need just 5 seconds of your time. This channel brings you the untold stories of World War II innovation, the unconventional weapons and tactics that actually won the war but get left out of traditional history. YouTube only shows these videos to more people when they see engagement happening. So if you're fascinated by how America won through industrial creativity and unconventional thinking, hit that like button right now and subscribe with notifications on, because next week's story about the American weapon that destroyed 800 Japanese aircraft in 1 month is even more incredible. Now let's see how JFK's plywood boat and 1,500 others like it proved that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't the biggest or strongest, but the one your enemy never takes seriously until it's too late. The mosquito fleet concept. The PT boat, patrol torpedo boat, emerged from an unusual place in American military development: desperation mixed with innovation. In 1938, as war clouds gathered over Europe, the U.S. Navy faced a strategic problem. America's battle fleet was powerful, but concentrated in large, expensive capital ships. Protecting the vast Pacific Ocean against Japanese expansion required presence in thousands of miles of coastal waters, island chains, and narrow straits where battleships and cruisers couldn't effectively operate. Traditional naval doctrine offered no solution. Building enough destroyers and cruisers to patrol every strategic waterway would take decades and cost billions. The Navy needed something different, something cheap enough to build in large numbers, fast enough to strike and escape, and small enough to operate in restricted waters. The answer came from an unusual source: wealthy sportsmen who raced motorboats. In the 1930s, civilian motor racing had developed hulls and engines that could achieve speeds over 40 knots, faster than any military vessel afloat. Several designers approached the Navy with proposals to weaponize these high-speed boats. The concept was radical. Take a motor racing hull, install aircraft engines for maximum speed, arm it with torpedoes and machine guns, and crew it with a dozen men. The resulting vessel would cost $250,000, less than a single 5-inch gun turret on a cruiser. It could be built in small boatyards in weeks rather than years. And most revolutionary, it could go places and do things that conventional warships couldn't. The Navy was skeptical. Captain Russell Crenshaw, writing an assessment of early PT boat proposals in 1939, "These vessels represent interesting technical achievements, but questionable military utility. The lack of armor makes them vulnerable to even small-caliber return fire. The wooden construction cannot withstand combat damage. The gasoline engines present extreme fire hazards. The small crews cannot sustain casualties. These boats may have value for harbor patrol and limited coastal defense, but they cannot be considered frontline combat vessels." But a few visionary officers saw potential others missed. Commander John Bulkley recognized that speed and stealth could substitute for armor in certain tactical situations. If a PT boat could approach targets under cover of darkness, deliver torpedoes at close range, and escape at 40 knots before enemy gunners could react, the lack of armor became irrelevant because the boat wouldn't get hit. The specifications that emerged seemed almost comical compared to conventional warships. PT boat specifications: length, 80 feet. Displacement, 56 tons. Hull, plywood over wooden frames. Engines, 3 Packard V12 aircraft engines, 4,500 horsepower total. Maximum speed, 41 knots, 47 miles per hour. Armament, 4 21-inch torpedoes, machine guns. Crew, 12 officers and enlisted men. Armor, none. Range, 500 miles at cruising speed. Cost, $250,000. Compare this to a Fletcher-class destroyer, the Navy's standard small warship. Fletcher-class destroyer. Length, 376 feet. Displacement, 2,700 tons. Hull, steel with armor plating. Engines, steam turbines, 60,000 horsepower. Maximum speed, 38 knots, the Navy's standard small warship. Armament, 5 5-inch guns, torpedoes, depth charges, anti-aircraft weapons. Crew, 273 officers and enlisted men. Cost, $6 million. Construction time, 18 months. The destroyer was 48 times heavier, cost 24 times more, took 10 times longer to build, and required 23 times more crew. Yet the PT boat was actually faster and could operate in shallow waters where destroyers couldn't go.
American industrial philosophy recognized an opportunity. Build 24 PT boats for the cost of 1 destroyer, except that some would be lost, and overwhelm the enemy with numbers and presence in places conventional ships couldn't reach. German and Japanese naval observers dismissed this as typical American industrial waste, building cheap, expendable boats instead of quality warships. They would learn that quantity had a quality all its own. The production miracle. PT boat production represented American small boat building expertise scaled to industrial levels. Unlike battleships and carriers that required massive specialized shipyards, PT boats could be built anywhere with boat-building facilities and skilled woodworkers. Elko Naval Division in Bayonne, New Jersey, became the largest PT boat manufacturer, ultimately building 399 boats. Higgins Industries in New Orleans, famous for landing craft, built 205 PT boats. Huckins Yacht Corporation in Florida built 18. Philadelphia Navy Yard converted from building destroyers to assembling PT boats. Small boatyards across the country contributed components. The construction process adapted automotive mass production to boat building. Elko's facility operated like an assembly line. Wooden frames were pre-cut to templates. Plywood hull sections were shaped in jigs for perfect consistency. Engines arrived from Packard, already tested and ready for installation. Torpedoes, radios, and weapon systems were modular components installed in sequence. A single PT boat required approximately 12,000 man-hours from start to finish, about 8 weeks of calendar time. Compare this to 500,000 man-hours for a destroyer. The efficiency ratio was remarkable. A boatyard could produce 6 PT boats in the time a shipyard built 1 destroyer. The material requirements were equally favorable. A PT boat needed 20 tons of lumber, primarily mahogany plywood, no steel beyond engines and weapons, no armor plating, no complex welding. Skilled carpenters, not specialized shipfitters, did most construction. This meant PT boat production didn't compete with destroyer or carrier construction for resources. They used completely different materials and workforce skills. By 1943, American boatyards were completing 50 PT boats monthly. By 1944, monthly production exceeded 80 boats. Total wartime production, 768 PT boats completed between 1942 and 1945. The Germans and Japanese never developed equivalent production. Germany built approximately 250 motor torpedo boats, or E-boats, during the entire war, 1/3 American production, despite starting earlier. Japan built around 100 similar vessels. Neither nation could match American production rates because they lacked the combination of small boat industrial infrastructure, skilled woodworkers, and mass production philosophy. The Philippines. Baptism of fire. PT boats entered combat in the Philippines in December 1941, right after Pearl Harbor. The results were mixed, but instructive. Japanese forces invading the Philippines vastly outnumbered American defenders. PT boats operating from Bataan and Corregidor conducted nightly raids against Japanese shipping and naval forces. Lieutenant John Bolke's Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3, 6 PT boats, became the most famous American unit in the Philippines campaign. Operating under impossible conditions, with no air cover and limited supplies, these boats conducted aggressive attacks that achieved disproportionate impact. On the night of December 22, 1941, PT boats attacked Japanese transports in Lingayen Gulf. The engagement demonstrated both PT boat potential and limitations. The boats achieved surprise, launching torpedoes at anchored transports from 600 yards. However, multiple torpedo malfunctions, a problem that would plague American torpedoes throughout 1942, meant actual sinking results were minimal despite successful attacks. What PT boats did achieve was disruption. Japanese invasion forces had to deploy destroyers to screen against PT boat attacks. Transport schedules were delayed as ships waited for daylight to enter harbors. The presence of a handful of aggressive PT boats forced the Japanese to divert significant resources to counter a tiny threat. This assessment would prove premature. The PT boats that survived the Philippines campaign had learned crucial lessons about tactics, maintenance, and operational employment that would transform the force. The Solomons. Tactics evolved. The Solomon Islands campaign, beginning in August 1942, provided the environment where PT boat tactics matured. The narrow straits, numerous islands, and Japanese determination to reinforce their positions created perfect conditions for PT boat operations. The Tokyo Express, Japanese destroyer runs bringing reinforcements and supplies to Guadalcanal under cover of darkness, became the primary PT boat target. Japanese destroyers, moving at high speed through narrow passages at night, seemed invulnerable to conventional countermeasures. American surface ships couldn't intercept them consistently. Aircraft couldn't operate effectively at night. PT boats became the only American naval asset that could challenge the Tokyo Express. The tactics that evolved were simple but effective. Position PT boats along known Japanese transit routes, wait in ambush with engines idling quietly, attack when Japanese ships appeared, then escape at maximum speed before Japanese guns could respond effectively. Lieutenant Commander Robert Kelly, commanding PT Boat Squadron 2 in the Solomons, developed the doctrine that would guide PT boat operations throughout the war. His September 1942 tactical guidance emphasized Kelly's PT boat tactics. Use darkness and weather for concealment, position near shore where boat silhouette blends with land background, idle engines until attack to minimize detection, close to 500 to 800 yards before torpedo launch for maximum accuracy, launch torpedoes, then immediately retire at maximum speed. Use evasive maneuvers and smoke if engaged. Never remain in area after attack. Speed is survival. These tactics worked because they exploited PT boats' strengths, speed, small size, and maneuverability, while avoiding situations that exposed weaknesses, like lack of armor. The results began to accumulate. On October 11, 1942, PT boats intercepted a Tokyo Express run and damaged 2 destroyers with torpedo hits. November 7, PT boats sank a Japanese supply barge and damaged a destroyer. December 2, successful torpedo attack on a Japanese cruiser. The individual successes were less important than the cumulative effect. Japanese naval forces had to deploy escorts, alter schedules, and route ships away from PT boat operating areas. The mosquitoes weren't sinking large numbers of ships, but they were disrupting Japanese operations and forcing resource allocation to counter a threat that conventional wisdom said shouldn't matter.
Japanese responses escalated. Destroyers began deploying depth charges against PT boats, an admission that surface gunfire alone wasn't effectively countering the fast, small targets. Japanese aircraft started patrolling PT boat bases at dusk and dawn, attempting to catch the boats during transit. Additional destroyers were assigned to escort duties that would have been unnecessary against conventional threats. Admiral Raizo Tanaka, commanding the destroyer squadrons running the Tokyo Express, modified his assessment of PT boats in a January 1943 report. American motor torpedo boats represent a more significant threat than initially evaluated. While individual attacks rarely achieve decisive results, the cumulative effect of sustained operations forces allocation of escort resources and constrains operational flexibility. These vessels exploit our vessels' limitations in detecting and engaging small, high-speed targets at night. Recommend development of improved radar and fire control systems for small target engagement. Blackett Strait, Kennedy's trial. August 2, 1943. The incident that would make PT-109 famous demonstrated both the heroism of PT boat crews and the genuine dangers they faced. Lieutenant John F. Kennedy commanded PT-109 on patrol in Blackett Strait as part of efforts to interdict Japanese barge traffic supporting their garrison on Kolombangara Island. The night was moonless, visibility near zero. PT-109 was idling with muffled engines, waiting to intercept Japanese vessels. At 0200 hours, a massive shape emerged from the darkness, the Japanese destroyer Amagiri, part of a Tokyo Express run traveling at high speed. What happened next occurred in seconds. Amagiri's lookouts didn't spot PT-109 until collision was unavoidable. The small wooden boat didn't show on Japanese radar and was nearly invisible in the darkness. Amagiri's captain attempted to evade, but at 30 knots closing speed, collision was inevitable. The destroyer's bow struck PT-109 nearly amidships, cutting the boat in two. The impact and resulting gasoline fire killed 2 crew members instantly. The forward section of PT-109 sank immediately. The aft section, still afloat due to watertight compartments, became the survivors' refuge. Kennedy and 10 surviving crew members clung to the wreckage. Kennedy, despite injuries, spent the next hours swimming between crew members, ensuring all survivors reached the floating section of hull. When the wreckage began sinking,
Kennedy led the survivors on a 3.5-mile swim to a small island, towing an injured crew member by swimming with the man's life jacket strap in his teeth. The survival story, Kennedy's leadership during the 5-day ordeal before rescue, the coconut message that reached Australian coast watchers, the rescue by native islanders in PT boats would become American legend. But the incident also revealed uncomfortable truths about PT boat operations. PT boats were vulnerable. The wooden hull that kept costs low and allowed mass production offered no protection against collision, gunfire, or explosion. The gasoline engines that provided spectacular speed could turn the boat into a fireball if the small crew meant every casualty significantly degraded capability. The incident sparked debate within the Navy. Critics argued that PT-109's loss proved these boats were too vulnerable for continued operations. Proponents countered that PT boats had conducted thousands of patrols and hundreds of engagements. Losses were inevitable, but not disproportionate to results achieved. Admiral William Halsey, commanding South Pacific Forces, reviewed PT boat effectiveness and concluded, "PT boats have proven valuable in our operations. They operate in waters and conditions where larger vessels cannot go. They tie down enemy resources. They provide harassment and interdiction capabilities that complement our main fleet operations. While losses occur, the boats are replaceable and crews generally survive due to the boat's small size and wooden construction, which often allows boats to stay afloat even when heavily damaged. Recommend continued aggressive PT boat operations." The tide turns. PT boats ascendant. By late 1943, PT boat tactics had evolved to maximize effectiveness. Boats operated in coordinated groups rather than individually. Radar installations, small sets that barely fit aboard but gave precious warning of approaching vessels, were installed on increasing numbers of boats. Weapons upgrades replaced some torpedoes with additional guns, recognizing that many engagements were against barges and small craft, where gunfire was more effective than torpedoes. The addition of 40mm automatic cannons and multiple 50-caliber machine guns transformed PT boats into formidable gunboats. Against Japanese barges, wooden vessels carrying troops and supplies, PT boats with heavy machine gun armament were devastatingly effective. In the Central Pacific, PT boats supported the island-hopping campaign. At Kwajalein, Eniwet, and Saipan, PT boats patrolled lagoons and harbors, preventing Japanese reinforcement or evacuation, intercepting suicide boats, and providing gunfire support for landing forces. The Philippines' liberation in late 1944 saw PT boats return in force to waters where they had fought desperate defensive actions in 1942. Now, with American naval and air superiority established, PT boats operated aggressively against remaining Japanese shipping. Commander Selman Bowling, commanding PT boat squadrons in the Philippines, reported in November 1944, "PT boats are achieving results that exceed pre-war expectations. Operating in shallow coastal waters, rivers, and among islands where larger vessels cannot go, PT boats have sunk or damaged over 150 enemy vessels since Philippines operations began. These include barges, small freighters, patrol craft, and suicide boats. Additionally, PT boats have rescued 127 downed airmen, conducted special operations insertions, and provided fire support for ground forces. The versatility and effectiveness of these boats have suppressed initial skepticism." The EU European theater. Different war, same effectiveness. PT boats in European waters fought a different war than their Pacific counterparts, facing different enemies and conditions. The English Channel, Mediterranean, and Adriatic seas presented shorter distances, more sophisticated enemy forces, and different tactical challenges. German E-boats, motor torpedo boats similar to American PT boats, but with diesel engines and metal hulls, proved worthy opponents. The battles between PT boats and E-boats demonstrated that small, fast attack craft could be effective even against similarly equipped adversaries.
In the Mediterranean, PT boats supported the invasions of Sicily, Salerno, and Anzio. They patrolled against German E-boats attempting to attack invasion fleets. interdicted Axis coastal shipping, and conducted special operations, including inserting OSS agents on enemy coasts. Lieutenant Commander Stanley Barnes, commanding PT Boat Squadron 15 in the Mediterranean, noted in his June 1944 action report, "PT boats in this theater face more sophisticated opposition than Pacific boats typically encounter. German E-boats are formidable opponents with professional crews. German coastal defenses include radar and coordinated artillery. However, PT boats' speed and maneuverability remain decisive advantages. We achieved mission success through aggressive tactics and acceptance of calculated risks." The D-Day invasion saw PT boats assigned to screen the massive invasion fleet against possible E-boat attacks. While E-boats made limited attempts to disrupt the invasion, PT boat presence helped prevent more aggressive German small craft operations. The human dimension. Behind the tactical successes and strategic impact were young men, often in their early 20s, commanding boats and crews in combat conditions that tested courage and seamanship equally. PT boat duty was voluntary, attracted aggressive personalities, and developed leadership through experience rather than extended training. The typical PT boat commander was a junior officer, often a lieutenant junior grade or lieutenant, with extensive responsibility. Commanding a boat with a dozen crew members, carrying torpedoes worth more than the boat itself, and making split-second tactical decisions under fire required maturity beyond the average age of 24. Crew members developed intense camaraderie. Living in close quarters on small boats, depending on each other for survival, and facing combat together created bonds that PT boat veterans maintained decades after the war. The informal command structure, small crews where everyone knew everyone, officers who worked alongside enlisted men, was unusual for naval vessels, but suited the PT boat mission. The casualty rate, while significant, was lower than initially feared. Of 768 PT boats built, approximately 69 were lost to enemy action and 98 to accidents and weather, a 22% total loss rate. However, crew survival rates were high because the wooden boats often remained afloat even when severely damaged, and the small size meant crew could abandon ship quickly. Contrast this with submarines, where a hull penetration meant the entire crew was lost. PT boat crews faced danger, but they had a reasonable chance of survival even if their boat was destroyed, a psychological factor that contributed to the aggressive tactics PT boat crews employed. The strategic impact. Evaluating PT boat strategic effectiveness requires looking beyond simple tonnage sunk statistics. PT boats sank approximately 200 Japanese vessels confirmed during the war, not overwhelming compared to submarines' 1,400-plus kills. But tonnage sunk wasn't the complete measure of impact. PT boats forced enemy resource allocation. Japanese destroyers, patrol craft, and aircraft assigned to counter PT boats couldn't be used elsewhere. The defensive measures, routing ships away from PT boat operating areas, deploying escorts, maintaining air patrols, represented significant resource expenditure. PT boats provided presence. In thousands of miles of Pacific coastal waters and island chains, PT boats were often the only American naval presence. Their aggressive patrolling and willingness to engage created perception of American naval power far beyond their actual numbers. PT boats conducted missions impossible for larger vessels, operating in water too shallow for destroyers, penetrating harbors and rivers, conducting special operations. PT boats provided capabilities that complemented rather than competed with conventional naval forces. The 768 PT boats built cost approximately $192 million total, less than the cost of 3 Iowa-class battleships. The return on investment, measured in operational impact rather than simple tonnage sunk, was remarkable. The Japanese reassessment. By 1944, Japanese naval officers who had dismissed PT boats as mosquitoes had revised their assessment. Combat reports increasingly emphasized PT boats' effectiveness and the difficulties of countering them. A March 1944 Naval Intelligence Summary stated, "American motor torpedo boats have proven more effective than pre-war assessments predicted. Their high speed, small size, and aggressive tactics make them difficult targets for our vessels. They operate effectively in shallow coastal waters where our larger vessels cannot pursue. Their presence restricts our operational flexibility and forces deployment of assets to patrol and escort duties. While individually weak, their cumulative impact on our logistics and coastal operations is significant." Admiral Matome Ugaki, commander of Japanese battleship forces and later Fifth Air Fleet, wrote in his diary in July 1944 after PT boat attacks disrupted operations, "These American plywood boats are like wasps, individually minor threats, but collectively they sting repeatedly and force us to expend energy swatting at them. We cannot ignore them, and yet countering them diverts resources from more important operations. This is effective American strategy, using cheap, expendable assets to impose disproportionate costs on us." The post-war verdict. When the war ended in August 1945, the Navy decommissioned PT boats rapidly. The specialized role they filled, fast attack craft for coastal and restricted waters, wasn't needed in a peacetime Navy focused on global presence through large carriers and submarines. But the PT boat concept influenced subsequent naval development. The Israeli Navy's development of fast attack craft armed with missiles in the 1960s drew directly on PT boat experience. Soviet torpedo boat development referenced American PT boat operations. The concept of small, fast, heavily armed vessels for coastal defense and attack became standard in many navies. The PT boat veterans, who had served on boats most naval officers considered unsuitable for serious operations, had proven that unconventional thinking could achieve results conventional forces couldn't. Their legacy was institutionalized in the Navy's continuing willingness to explore unconventional capabilities. Admiral Arleigh Burke, who commanded destroyers in the Solomons and often worked with PT boats, later summarized their contribution. PT boats demonstrated that in warfare, there's value in assets that don't fit conventional categories. They weren't capital ships, weren't frontline combatants in traditional sense, but they achieved things nothing else could achieve. They operated where bigger ships couldn't go, conducted missions that didn't fit anyone's pre-war planning, and proved effective through aggressive employment and tactical innovation. That's a lesson that extends beyond PT boats to all military operations. Sometimes the most valuable capability is the one nobody initially took seriously. Conclusion: the mosquitoes that mattered. When Admiral Raizo Tanaka called PT boats mosquitoes in early 1943, he intended it as dismissive comparison. By war's end, the comparison had become apt in ways he didn't anticipate. Mosquitoes are small, individually insignificant, easily killed, but collectively they alter behavior, force defensive measures, and achieve impact disproportionate to their size. PT boats were exactly this. Each boat was expendable, vulnerable, limited in capability, but 768 boats conducting thousands of patrols, hundreds of attacks, and countless support missions became a persistent presence that Japan couldn't ignore and couldn't effectively eliminate. The PT boat program validated American industrial philosophy: build many inexpensive assets rather than few expensive ones, accept losses, and achieve victory through persistence and presence rather than individual superiority. This philosophy extended across American war production: Liberty ships, Sherman tanks, thousands of aircraft, but the PT boat exemplified it in its purest form. John F. Kennedy's experience on PT-109, which would help propel him to the presidency 20 years later,
represented both the danger PT boat crews faced and the impact these boats achieved. The incident that nearly killed Kennedy also demonstrated why PT boats worked. Small enough to operate where larger ships couldn't, manned by crews with initiative and courage, and numerous enough that losing boats didn't cripple the program. The Japanese admirals who laughed at PT boats learned that in modern warfare, conventional measures of naval power, tonnage, armor, big guns, weren't the only factors that mattered. Speed, stealth, tactical flexibility, and sheer persistence could achieve strategic impact without ever winning a pitched battle against heavy warships.
By 1945, no one was laughing at the plywood boats anymore. They had become, improbably, one of the success stories of American naval innovation. Proof that sometimes the best answer to overwhelming enemy strength isn't to build something bigger and stronger, but to build something completely different that operates by different rules. The Mosquito fleet had proven that even wooden boats crewed by young men could change the mathematics of naval warfare when built in numbers large enough, employed aggressively enough, and supported by an industrial base that could replace losses faster than combat created them. The PT boat wasn't the weapon that won the war, but it was the weapon that demonstrated American willingness to challenge conventional thinking, build unconventional solutions, and prove that sometimes the experts who declare something impossible are wrong. Wooden boats could survive naval combat, small vessels could matter strategically, and mosquitoes could indeed change the outcome of battles.